Li Jinho stared at his reflection in the polished metal wall of the Galactic Academy's main hall. His human face looked out of place among the colorful alien beings walking past him. He adjusted his plain gray uniform and took a deep breath. It was another day of being different at the most prestigious school in the galaxy. The year was 2157, and Jinho was the only human student at the academy. He had earned his place through hard work and brilliant test scores, but that didn't matter to most of his classmates. To them, he was just a primitive being who couldn't naturally sense quantum fields. Jinho walked into his first class of the day, Advanced Quantum Propulsion. The classroom was a large circular chamber with floating seats arranged in rising tiers. As usual, the seats near him emptied quickly as other students moved away. He pretended not to notice. Professor Park Sunwoo stood at the center of the room, his holographic displays showing complex equations about wormhole formation. Today, we will practice stabilizing quantum fields, the professor announced. Please activate your neural interfaces. Jinho's heart sank. He didn't have a neural interface. Humans couldn't use them. Instead, he pulled out his datapad and special glasses. Some students snickered. Look at him using physical tools. A voice whispered loudly. How ancient. It was Du Yun, the top student in the class. His silver skin gleamed as he turned to face Jinho. Like all Centaurians, Du Yun could manipulate quantum fields naturally. He didn't need tools or technology. It was as easy as breathing for him. Mr. Lee, Professor Park called out. Perhaps you would like to demonstrate the basic field stabilization technique. Jinho stood up slowly. He knew this was coming. Every few days, someone would ask him to demonstrate something they knew he couldn't do naturally. He walked to the center of the room, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Of course, Professor, Jinho said calmly. He pulled out a small device he had built himself. It wasn't pretty, just a metal box with some buttons and a display screen. But it worked. Jinho pressed a few buttons, and the air in front of him began to shimmer. A small quantum field appeared, perfectly stable. It wasn't as large or as elegant as what the other students could create naturally, but it was there. Interesting approach, Professor Park said, studying the device, though rather slow and mechanical. More laughs from the class. Du Yun raised his hand. Professor, allow me to demonstrate the proper technique. Du Yun stood up and, with a casual wave of his hand, created a massive, perfectly formed quantum field. It sparkled with complex patterns that Jinho's device could never produce. The class applauded. Excellent, Du Yun, Professor Park said. That is how it should be done. Jinho returned to his seat, his face burning but his expression neutral. He had learned to hide his feelings well. As he sat down, he noticed his datapad was missing. He looked up to see Du Yun floating it above his head using a quantum field. Looking for this, primitive? Du Yun asked with a smirk. Perhaps you should try grabbing it with your natural abilities. Oh wait. The class laughed again. Jinho stood perfectly still, waiting. After a few moments, Du Yun let the datapad fall. Jinho caught it smoothly. His human reflexes were still good for something. As the class continued, Jinho took careful notes. While others practiced their natural abilities, he sketched designs in the margins of his notes, ideas for machines that could do what the aliens did naturally. Most would say it was impossible. Humans trying to match advanced alien technology through mere mechanics. But Jinho had a secret. In his private time, he had been working on something in the old workshop basement, something that would change everything. He glanced at his latest sketches and allowed himself a small smile. Let them laugh, he thought. Soon they would see what human ingenuity could really do. The class ended, and students flowed out of the room like a colorful river. Jinho packed his things slowly, checking his datapad for damage. As he walked out, Professor Park called to him. Mr. Lee, the professor said, while your device is interesting, you might consider focusing on theoretical work instead. Some things are simply beyond mechanical solutions. Jin-Ho nodded politely. Thank you for the advice, Professor. But in his mind, he was already planning his next workshop session. He had noticed something in today's lecture, a small flaw in the accepted theories about quantum field generation. Tonight, he would work on his project again. And maybe, just maybe, he would prove them all wrong. After classes ended, Jin-Ho waited until most students had left the academy's main building. The halls grew quiet as the artificial sun began to set outside the massive windows. This was his favorite time, when he could work without anyone watching or laughing. He took the old maintenance elevator down to the basement level. The doors opened with a soft hiss, revealing a long corridor lit by flickering blue lights. At the end was a heavy metal door marked Workshop B7, decommissioned. Jin-Ho smiled as he placed his hand on the security scanner. Welcome back, Lead Jin-Ho, a friendly voice said as the door opened. You're earlier than usual today. The voice belonged to Kim Myray, the Academy's maintenance AI specialist. She appeared as a hologram near the door, a young woman in a technical uniform. Unlike most advanced AIs who chose exotic appearances, Myray preferred a simple human form. Rough day in class, Jin-Ho said, walking into the large workshop. I need to work on the project. The workshop was a maze of old machines, tools, and spare parts. While the upper floors of the academy were all smooth surfaces and quantum technology, this place was wonderfully mechanical. Gears, pistons, and metal components filled the shelves. A large workbench stood in the center, covered with Jin-Ho's tools and drawings. I saw what happened in Professor Park's class, Myray said, her hologram following him. Du-Yun is becoming more aggressive. Jin-Ho shrugged as he laid out his tools. He's afraid. They all are. They don't understand how someone without natural quantum abilities could be at the academy. Mayray's hologram sat on a nearby stool. She didn't need to sit, but she did it to seem more natural. Most AIs don't understand either. They think pure quantum processing is the only way forward. That's why they assign me to maintenance duty, because I believe mechanical systems still have value. Jin-Ho pulled out his latest prototype from under the workbench. It was a complex device about the size of a small car engine. Tubes and wires connected various mechanical parts in a pattern that looked chaotic, but followed a precise design. What they don't understand, Jin-Ho said as he began adjusting the device, is that mechanical systems can be more reliable than natural abilities. A machine doesn't get tired. It doesn't need to be born with special powers. Anyone can learn to use it. He connected his datapad to the prototype and showed Myray his notes from class. Look at this equation Professor Park showed us today. Everyone focuses on the quantum field generation, but they're missing something in the space-time calculations. Myray studied the equations, her holographic eyes scanning quickly. You're right. They assume quantum manipulation is the only way to create a stable wormhole. But if you approach it mechanically. Exactly, Jin-Ho said, reaching for a wrench. We don't need to create quantum fields naturally. We just need to build a machine that can generate the same effect through mechanical means. For the next few hours, they worked together. Myray ran simulations while Jin-Ho made adjustments to the prototype. She could access the Academy's vast computer systems without anyone noticing, giving him data he could never get officially. As Jin-Ho tightened the last bolt, a soft hum filled the workshop. The prototype was starting up. Small lights blinked across its surface as internal components began to move. Power levels are stable, Myray reported. No quantum signature detectable. As far as any sensors are concerned, this device doesn't exist. Jin-Ho wiped grease from his hands and smiled. Good. The last thing we need is Du-Yun, or the professors finding out what we're building. Not until it's ready. Jin-Ho, Myray said softly, what you're attempting, creating an artificial wormhole through purely mechanical means, everyone says it's impossible. He looked at the prototype, his eyes determined. That's what they said about humans reaching the stars. But here we are, in a school billions of light years from Earth. The impossible just takes a little longer. May Ray's hologram smiled. Well, you have one fan at least, though I'm not sure how much support a maintenance AI can offer. You've helped more than you know, Jin-Ho said. Sometimes just having someone believe in you is enough. As they prepared to shut down for the night, Jin-Ho made one final adjustment to the prototype. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more doubts from his professors, more mockery from Du-Yun. But here in the workshop, with his tools and his dreams, none of that mattered. He was building the future, one piece at a time. Professor Park's quantum propulsion class was usually quiet. Today, however, the silence was broken by Jin-Ho's voice. "Excuse me, Professor, but I think there's an error in the theory." The entire class turned to look at him. Du-Yun's silver face showed a mix of amusement and anger. Professor Park stopped writing on the holographic board and turned slowly. "An error, Mr. Lee." Professor Park's voice was cold. "This theory has been accepted for over 300 years. Jin-Ho stood up, holding his datapad. His hands were slightly shaky, but his voice was firm. "The basic assumption about quantum field generation is wrong. We've been looking at it from only one perspective, the biological one." He walked down to the front of the class. Professor Park stepped aside, more curious than angry now. Jin-Ho connected his datapad to the main display. "Look at this equation," Jin-Ho said, pointing to the complex formula. "We assume quantum fields must be generated by living beings because that's how advanced species do it. But what if we approached it differently?" He began to draw new equations next to the old ones. The class watched in silence as he worked. Even Du-Yun leaned forward slightly. "If we treat space-time as a mechanical system instead of a quantum field, we get different results," Jin-Ho explained. "The same way ancient humans built machines to fly instead of growing wings, we can build machines to manipulate space-time instead of evolving natural abilities." Professor Park studied the equations carefully. "This is unusual, but it doesn't prove anything. Theory is one thing, Mr. Lee. Practice is another. I can prove it works," Jin-Ho said quickly. Then he stopped, realizing he had said too much. Du-Yun's laugh filled the room. "Prove it. You can barely generate a stable quantum field with your primitive devices. How could you prove anything about space-time manipulation?" Jin-Ho took a deep breath. He had prepared for this moment, but it was still difficult. "I've been working on something, a mechanical system that could generate the same effects as natural quantum abilities. If I could demonstrate it." "Enough," Professor Park said firmly. "This is a serious academic institution, not a place for human mechanical toys. Return to your seat, Mr. Lee." Jin-Ho walked back to his seat, his face burning. But he noticed something interesting. Professor Park had saved his equations instead of deleting them. After class, Jin-Ho hurried toward the workshop. He needed to work on his prototype, but a voice stopped him. "Mr. Lee, a moment please." It was Professor Park. Jin-Ho turned, expecting another lecture about respecting traditional theories. "Your equations," Professor Park said quietly, "they're not entirely wrong. But what you're suggesting would change everything we know about quantum propulsion. Isn't that the point of science?" Jin-Ho asked. "To find new ways of understanding things." Professor Park looked around to make sure they were alone. "Meet me in my office after your last class. Bring your research. All of it." Jin-Ho's heart raced. "Yes, Professor." Later that day, in Professor Park's office, Jin-Ho spread out his drawings and calculations. He explained his theory in detail, how mechanical systems could replicate and even improve upon natural quantum abilities. Professor Park listened silently, taking notes. Finally, he spoke. "This could work, but it would face enormous resistance. The entire galactic society is built on the idea that only naturally gifted species can manipulate quantum fields. That's exactly why it needs to work," Jin-Ho said. Humans aren't the only species without natural quantum abilities. Think of how many others could benefit from this technology. Professor Park nodded slowly. I cannot openly support this research. The academic council would never approve. But he handed Jinho a small data crystal. This contains access codes to the Advanced Physics Simulation Lab. Use it wisely, and only after normal hours. Jinho held the crystal carefully. Thank you, Professor. Don't thank me yet, Professor Park said. If you're wrong about this, it could end both our careers. But if you're right, he smiled slightly. Well, let's just say the galaxy isn't ready for what that would mean. As Jinho left the office, his mind was already racing with new ideas. With access to the simulation lab, he could test his theories properly. The prototype in his workshop was about to get some major upgrades. The Academy's main hall was filled with excited students. A large holographic announcement floated in the air, displaying the details of the annual Engineering Excellence Competition. Jinho stood at the back of the crowd, reading carefully. This year's challenge was perfect. Design a new faster-than-light propulsion system. The winning design would be considered for actual production by the Galactic Engineering Council. It was exactly what Jinho needed, a chance to prove his theories worked. Planning to enter, primitive. Do Yun's voice cut through the excited chatter. The silver-skinned Centaurian stood behind Jinho, surrounded by his usual group of supporters. Yes, I am, Jinho said calmly, turning to face them. How amusing, Du Yun said. The competition has never had a human finalist, but I suppose someone needs to come in last place. Instead of walking away, Jinho stood his ground. Actually, I have a proposal for you, Du Yun. The crowd grew quiet. Even Du Yun looked surprised. Let's make this interesting, Jinho continued. If I beat you in the competition, you stop calling me primitive and treat humans with respect. Du Yun's silver skin rippled with amusement. And when you lose, if I lose, I'll withdraw from the academy. The crowd gasped. Du Yun's eyes narrowed. You would give up your place here, your precious human dream of proving yourself. Jinho nodded. Those are my terms, unless you're not confident about winning. Du Yun's face hardened. Very well. I accept your challenge. It will be a pleasure to finally be rid of you. Later that evening, Jinho sat in the workshop, staring at his prototype. Mei Rei's hologram appeared beside him. Are you sure about this? She asked. The competition is in 3 weeks, and you just wagered your entire academic career. Jinho adjusted some wires on his device. It was the only way. Du Yun would never take me seriously otherwise. Now he has to pay attention to my work. But 3 weeks isn't much time, Mei Rei said. Your prototype barely generates a stable field for more than a few seconds. Then we'll work harder, Jinho said. He pulled up the simulation data from Professor Park's lab. Look at these results. The mechanical approach is working. We just need to solve the power regulation problem. Mei Rei studied the data. The simulation shows promise, but building it is different. The materials you need are all available here, Jinho finished. These old workshops have everything. The Academy switched to quantum technology so quickly, they left behind perfectly good mechanical parts. He worked through the night, Mei Rei helping with calculations and simulations. The prototype slowly took shape. Each failure taught him something new. Each small success brought him closer to his goal. Word of the challenge spread through the academy. Most students thought Jinho was foolish. Some felt sorry for him. A few secretly hoped he would succeed, though they never said it openly. Professor Park called Jinho to his office again. This challenge was reckless, the professor said. Du Yun is the top student in the academy. His natural quantum abilities are exceptional. That's exactly why I need to beat him, Jinho replied. To show that natural ability isn't everything. That hard work and different thinking can succeed too. Professor Park sighed. Your access to the simulation lab will continue. But be careful. Du Yun has powerful friends, and he won't take the possibility of losing lightly. Jin Ho returned to his workshop with renewed determination. On his workbench, the prototype hummed quietly. Its mechanical parts moved in perfect harmony, creating something that the galaxy's greatest mind said was impossible. "My-Ray," he called out, "let's run another test. I think I've solved the power regulation issue." As the artificial night fell outside, Jin Ho worked on. The competition would change everything. One way or another, he had 3 weeks to prove that humanity's primitive technology could match the most advanced species in the galaxy. He smiled as he made another adjustment to his machine. 3 weeks to change the future. It would be enough. It had to be. The simulation lab was quiet at midnight. Jin Ho sat alone, surrounded by holographic displays showing his latest test results. He had been working for 18 hours straight, and his eyes were tired. But he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close. "Jin Ho," My-Ray's voice came through his earpiece. "Your vital signs show you need rest." "Just one more test," he said, adjusting the simulation parameters. "Something's different this time. The power flow is more stable." The holographic displays showed his mechanical engine design. Unlike the swirling quantum fields that alien ships used, his engine was all gears, pistons, and carefully arranged mechanical parts. It looked primitive to most aliens, but Jin Ho saw beauty in its complexity. "Running simulation test 247, My-Ray announced. The virtual engine started up. Numbers flowed across the screens as the mechanical parts began their careful dance. Jin Ho held his breath as the power levels rose. Then it happened. A small, stable wormhole appeared in the simulation. Not for just a few seconds like before, but for a full minute. Then 2 minutes. Then 5. "My-Ray," Jin Ho whispered, "are you seeing this?" "Confirmed," she replied. "The wormhole is completely stable. Power consumption is within acceptable limits. And, Jin Ho, there's no quantum field signature at all. It's working purely through mechanical means." Jin Ho sat back in his chair, his hands shaking slightly. After months of work, hundreds of failed tests, and countless adjustments, he had done it. He had proven that space-time could be manipulated without natural quantum abilities. "We need to test this on the real prototype," he said, standing up. "Can you transfer the new specifications to the workshop?" "Already done," My-Ray said. "But please get some rest first. The workshop will still be there after you sleep." Jin Ho smiled. "You sound like my mother." "Someone has to look after you," My-Ray replied. "Humans are remarkably bad at taking care of themselves." The next morning, Jin Ho rushed to the workshop as soon as his classes ended. He had barely paid attention during lectures, his mind focused on the breakthrough from the night before. The prototype sat waiting on his workbench. It looked different now, more finished, more purposeful. Jin Ho began making the adjustments from the successful simulation. "Power systems ready," My-Ray reported. "Workshop sensors are on private mode. No one will detect what we're about to do." Jin Ho took a deep breath and pressed the activation switch. The engine hummed to life, its parts moving in perfect synchronization. Gauges showed power levels rising steadily. A small light appeared in front of the engine. It grew slowly, forming a perfect circle of swirling energy. But unlike the quantum wormholes Jin Ho had seen before, this one was different. It was smooth, controlled, mechanical. "Wormhole stability at 98%, My-Ray announced. "No quantum field detected." "Jin Ho, you've done it. You've actually done it." Jin Ho walked around the wormhole, scanning it with his datapad. "The efficiency is even better than the simulation showed. And look at the power consumption. It's using less energy than standard quantum drives." "This will change everything," My-Ray said softly. "Not just for humans, but for all non-quantum species." Jin Ho nodded. "That's why we have to win the competition. This can't just be a theory or a prototype. It needs to be real. It needs to fly. He worked through the evening, refining and testing the engine. Each test showed the same results: stable wormholes, low power consumption, and no quantum fields needed. As he prepared to leave for the night, Professor Park appeared at the workshop door. "I saw the simulation results," the professor said. "I had to come see for myself." Jin-Ho stepped aside, letting his teacher examine the prototype. Professor Park walked around it slowly, studying every detail. "In 300 years of teaching," he said finally, "I have never seen anything like this. You haven't just created a new engine, Mr. Lee. You've created a new future." Jin-Ho knew something was wrong before he even opened the workshop door. The security panel was blinking red instead of its usual green. His access card didn't work. "Myray," he called out. "Are you there?" No response. The maintenance AI systems seemed to be offline. Jin-Ho's heart began to race as he used the emergency manual override Professor Park had shown him. The door slid open with a harsh grinding sound. The workshop's lights flickered on, revealing destruction. His workbench was overturned. Tools lay scattered across the floor. And his prototype, his beautiful engine that had worked so perfectly just yesterday, lay in pieces. "No," Jin-Ho whispered, rushing to the remains of his work. "No, no, no." Mechanical parts were bent and broken. Careful connections had been ripped apart. The control panel was completely shattered. 6 months of work, destroyed in minutes. The workshop's systems suddenly hummed back to life. Mayray's hologram appeared, flickering and unstable. "Jin-Ho," she said, her voice filled with static. "I'm sorry. They disabled my systems. I couldn't stop them." "Who did this?" Jin-Ho asked, though he already knew the answer. "Du Yun and 3 others. They used quantum fields to bypass security." Mayray's hologram stabilized. "I recorded everything, but they made sure to hide their faces." Jin-Ho picked up a broken gear, the main timing component he had spent weeks perfecting. The competition was in 4 days. Even if he worked without sleeping, there wasn't enough time to rebuild everything. "They were thorough," Mayray said softly. "They knew exactly what to break." Jin-Ho stood silent for a long moment, holding the broken gear. Then he walked to the workbench and set it upright. "Help me clean up," he said quietly. "Jin-Ho," Mayray said, "the competition will still happen in 4 days," he finished, "and we have work to do." For the next hour, they sorted through the wreckage. Jin-Ho carefully examined each broken part, sorting them into piles: destroyed, damaged, and salvageable. Professor Park arrived as Jin-Ho was assessing the damage to the control panel. "I came as soon as I heard," the professor said, looking around at the destruction. "This is unacceptable. We should report this to the Academy Council." Jin-Ho shook his head. "We have no proof it was Du Yun. And even if we did, the Council would never take the word of a maintenance AI over their star student." "Then withdraw from the competition," Professor Park suggested. "We can rebuild the engine properly, present it next year." "No," Jin-Ho said firmly. "That's what they want. To scare me away, to prove humans don't belong here." He picked up his tools. "I'm going to rebuild it. Better than before." Professor Park studied him carefully. 4 days isn't enough time. "Maybe not for a perfect engine," Jin-Ho agreed, "but enough for one that works. Mayray, show me the original design files." Holographic blueprints appeared in the air. Jin-Ho began marking changes, making quick calculations. "If we simplify the power distribution system," he said, "and modify the frame to use fewer moving parts." "Mayray, run these numbers." "It could work," she said after a moment. "The efficiency would be lower, but the basic principle would remain the same." Jin-Ho turned to Professor Park. "I'll need access to the fabrication lab, and if you could help with the quantum field calculations." The professor smiled slightly. You're either the most stubborn or the bravest student I've ever had." "Maybe both," Jin Ho said, managing a small smile of his own. "Will you help?" Professor Park rolled up his sleeves. "Tell me what you need." They worked through the night, salvaging what they could and redesigning what they couldn't. The new engine would be simpler, rougher, but its heart would be the same, proof that mechanical ingenuity could match natural quantum abilities. As he worked, Jin Ho thought of Du Yun's smug face, of all the times he'd been called primitive. He looked at the broken pieces of his first engine and made a promise to himself. This time, he wouldn't just build an engine. He would build a revolution. The Academy's main auditorium was packed. Students, teachers, and representatives from major engineering companies filled every seat. At the center of the stage stood 5 testing platforms, each ready to demonstrate a different faster-than-light drive design. Jin Ho stood backstage, making final adjustments to his rebuilt engine. It wasn't as elegant as his original design, but the core technology remained the same. 4 days of non-stop work had produced something that, at the very least, would work. "Your turn is last," Meirei said through his earpiece. "Du Yun goes first." Jin Ho nodded, watching as Du Yun stepped onto the stage. The Centaurian's silver skin gleamed under the bright lights as he presented his quantum drive design. "As we all know," Du Yun said smoothly, "the future of space travel lies in advanced quantum field manipulation. My design improves efficiency by 30% through enhanced neural interfacing." He demonstrated his engine with natural grace. The quantum fields formed perfect patterns in the air, drawing appreciative murmurs from the crowd. The test results showed impressive numbers. 3 more students presented their designs. Each one used variations of traditional quantum technology. Each one worked perfectly. The audience applauded politely after every demonstration. Finally, it was Jin Ho's turn. "Our final presenter," the head judge announced. "Lead Jin Ho." The audience grew quiet as Jin Ho walked onto the stage. His rebuilt engine sat on the testing platform, looking rough and primitive compared to the sleek quantum drives that had come before. "My design is different," Jin Ho began. "It doesn't use quantum fields or neural interfaces. It's completely mechanical." Laughter rippled through the audience. Du Yun, sitting in the front row, smiled mockingly. Instead of copying natural abilities, Jin Ho continued, "I chose to solve the problem a different way, the same way humans have always solved problems, through engineering and innovation." He activated the engine. It hummed to life, its mechanical parts moving in precise harmony. The sound was different from the whisper-quiet quantum drives. This was the sound of real work being done. "As you can see," Jin Ho said, pointing to the display screens, "the engine creates a stable wormhole through purely mechanical means. No quantum manipulation required." The audience leaned forward as a small wormhole formed in front of the engine. It was perfectly round, its edges smooth and controlled. "Impossible," someone in the audience said. "The readings must be wrong," another added. Professor Park stood up from his seat among the judges. "The readings are correct. This engine is generating a stable wormhole without any quantum field signature." Du Yun jumped to his feet. "This is ridiculous. He must be hiding quantum technology somewhere. No mechanical device can manipulate space-time." "Test it yourself," Jin Ho said calmly. "Scan it with your natural abilities. You won't find any quantum fields because there aren't any. This engine works on different principles entirely." The head judge walked over to examine the engine closely. She was from an advanced species that could naturally sense quantum fields. After a long moment, she stepped back, her expression surprised. "He's telling the truth," she announced. "This device creates stable wormholes through purely mechanical means. The implications are extraordinary." The audience erupted in excited discussion. Jin Ho could see company representatives talking urgently into their communicators. Several professors were already arguing about the theoretical principles involved. "The efficiency ratings," one judge noted, looking at the test results. They're comparable to standard quantum drives. In some areas, they're superior. Du Yun stood silent, his silver face unreadable. Their eyes met across the stage. Jin Ho gave him a small nod, remembering their bet. This technology, the head judge said, could make faster-than-light travel accessible to any species, regardless of their natural abilities. Mr. Lee, you haven't just created a new engine. You've created a new future for space travel. Jin Ho smiled, placing his hand on his engine. The machine hummed steadily, proof that humanity's so-called primitive approach had something valuable to offer the galaxy after all. 1 month after the competition, Jin Ho stood in his new office at the Academy. The wall display showed ships from across the galaxy arriving at Earth's space stations, all seeking to learn about the new mechanical wormhole drive. Mirai's hologram appeared beside him. The first production models are ready for testing, she reported. The Galactic Engineering Council has approved them for general use. Jin Ho nodded, looking at the prototype displayed in a clear case on his desk. It was his original engine, carefully restored after the sabotage. Now it stood as a symbol of what determination and different thinking could achieve. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Du Yun. Professor Lee, the Centaurian said formally. The silver-skinned student looked different now, more humble, less arrogant. The quantum field analysis you requested is complete. Thank you, Jin Ho said, accepting the data crystal. How is the research progressing? We found ways to combine quantum and mechanical principles, Du Yun replied. The efficiency improvements are significant. It seems both approaches have their strengths. After losing the competition, Du Yun had surprised everyone by asking to join Jin Ho's research team. I want to learn, he had said. Your victory showed me that being naturally gifted isn't enough. There's always more to discover. Professor Park entered the office next, followed by several alien engineers. The Academy Board meeting is about to start, he announced. They're ready to hear your proposal for the new department. Jin Ho gathered his materials. In the month since his victory, everything had changed. The Academy had appointed him as their youngest professor ever, and now they were considering his plan to create a department of mechanical quantum engineering. Species without natural quantum abilities are already enrolling, Professor Park said as they walked to the meeting. Your engine showed them they have a place here too. The main conference room was full when they arrived. Representatives from every major species sat around the table. Jin Ho took his place at the front, Mirai's hologram standing supportively beside him. Distinguished council members, Jin Ho began. A month ago, we proved that mechanical engineering could match natural quantum abilities. Now it's time to take the next step. He activated a holographic display showing his plans for the new department. By combining traditional mechanical engineering with quantum physics, we can create technologies that work for everyone. Not just the naturally gifted, but all species who dream of exploring the stars. The council members listened attentively as Jin Ho explained his vision. When he finished, the head of the academy stood up. Professor Lee, she said, your engine has already changed how we think about space travel. This department could change how we think about education itself. The council approves your proposal unanimously. Applause filled the room. Jin Ho saw Du Yun clapping alongside the others, genuine respect in his eyes. Professor Park beamed proudly from his seat. Later that evening, Jin Ho returned to the old workshop. It had been cleaned and upgraded, ready for new students to learn and experiment. But he had kept some of the old tools, remembering how they had helped him prove that humanity's primitive technology had value. You know, Mirai said, her hologram sitting on the familiar workbench. When you first came down here, I thought you were just another student with impossible dreams. Jin Ho smiled. Dreams only seem impossible until someone makes them real. He picked up a wrench, the same one he had used to build his first prototype. Soon, this workshop would be full of students from across the galaxy, each bringing their own ways of thinking, their own dreams to build. The first class would start tomorrow. Humans would work alongside aliens, mechanical engineering alongside quantum physics. Together, they would create things that neither approach could achieve alone. Jin Ho placed the wrench carefully on the workbench. He wasn't an outcast anymore. He had become something better, a bridge between worlds, proving that every species had something valuable to teach and something valuable to learn.